Hello everybody! So today we're going to show you how to manual swap a car. So there's a few reasons to do this, which we'll go over in a second. We are going to be doing two different cars. So we decided to do a video on one of them just to show you guys pretty much everything involved in the manual swap process. All the parts you need, which we have laid out here. All the tools you need, which we have laid out here. And we're going to go over the whole process of how to do it. Everything we're going to show you will pertain to any manual swap you're going to do. So all of the information you'll be able to take and do this with whichever car of your choosing. So there's a couple of reasons why you would do a manual swap in a car. So reason number one, probably the most common reason, would be if manual versions of those cars are really rare, really hard to find, really expensive, didn't exist, things like that. So that's probably going to be, I would say, the main reason for manual swapping a car. In this case, you would say, well, it's a Miata. Most of them came manual. Why wouldn't you just get a manual one? But there's a very good reason for that. The reason is you can find a much cleaner, much nicer automatic car than you can a manual car for a much, much cheaper price. So for example, this car is an automatic. It's only got 72,000 miles on it. It is bone stock. It has never been modified. The underneath is perfectly clean, which we'll show you guys. You just have a lot more opportunity to find like a really nice gem of a car when you find an automatic version of a sports car. Because if it hasn't been changed to manual, whoever owned it probably didn't beat on it much. They didn't rip it around. They didn't modify it because it's an automatic. So it's definitely the easiest way to find a gem, like a really nice example. And this isn't even a perfect car. It's obviously dirty right now, but in the grand scheme of Miatas around this age range, you know, the car is in excellent shape. All the seats are nice, interior's nice. Like I said, underneath, which we'll show you guys when we get it up on the rack, super nice. I mean, just the car overall is in very, very good shape, very, very low mileage because it's automatic, so it probably wasn't driven a whole ton. So that is a very good reason to do a manual swap. And because of that, because it's a car that commonly came in manual, finding the manual parts is very easy. You find someone like Ben who parts out Miatas, they're generally going to have everything you need. So let's go over everything you need to manual swap a car. Let's hear it. Let's hear you take us through it one by one.
What you need is like the transmission itself, like with all the sensors and like the speedometer sensor and all that stuff. The ECU from a manual car, the clutch pedal, obviously. You only need the actual brake pedal from a manual car, or you could cut down your stock like automatic pedal, like cut it down to manual size. You would need like a shifter with good boots, a clutch line, like the whole line from the master cylinder to the slave. We're using an aftermarket stainless line, so it's a little bit easier to bleed the clutch down the line. Definitely recommend like new clutch hydraulics, like the slave cylinder and the master cylinder. A manual drive shaft, because on the NBs, the output shaft on the trans is a lot larger on the autos, and then a PPF as well, which would be like a transmission mount for pretty much any other car.
Yes, exactly.
On Miatas and some RX-7s, they have a PPF.
So the power plant frame just basically attaches the transmission to the diff instead of having the trans and the diff independently mounted. But just imagine the PPF as a trans mount, which some vehicles are going to be the same, some they're going to be different. But as a general rule of thumb for pretty much any car you're going to manual swap, this is roughly the parts list you need. Some cars you might need a little bit less, some cars you might need a little bit more. But there's really not much more involved. And that's the reason for this how-to is when I first got into cars, I thought of a manual swap as like a really daunting process. And there was a couple cars that I could have got that would have been really good cars, and I just needed a manual swap them. And to me, it was too big of a process. I didn't want to take it on. I was afraid of it. You know, what if I couldn't find the parts? What if, you know, I need more than I think I need and I can't find it? And then, you know, as I've grown and as I've worked on cars for the past 10 years, I've realized, you know, just how simple a manual swap really is. There's really not much to it. So that's why we're going to cover exactly how to do it and show you guys who might have a good deal on an auto car, or might be looking at a car that didn't come in manual very much, but you wanted a manual, you know, just exactly how simple this process is and how to do it. So let's get started. The tools you will need will vary a little bit from car to car, but as a general rule of thumb, as far as the tools you will need to do a transmission swap, set of 1/2-inch sockets, set of 3/8 sockets, 1/2-inch impact, 3/8 impact. If you don't have impact, that's okay. You can use a 3/8 ratchet and a 1/2-inch ratchet. You will need some needle nose pliers for disconnecting things, some cutting dikes to cut clips and things like that, For us, we will need two 14 mil wrenches for the drive shaft bolts, a 17 mil wrench for one of the trans bolts, 10 mil wrench for the slave cylinder stuff. You will need, if possible, very long extensions. This is very helpful for doing it in the car, being able to reach up to the top trans bolts, and ideally with a wobble or a swivel. Might have to add a swivel to this actually. Pry bar to pry the bell housing apart if it's stuck and the dowels have been on there a long time. Some vehicles have trouble with that, not all of them. And then importantly, light. So you either have floodlights like this, which work okay under a car. Best thing you can do is a headlamp. Headlamps are amazing. You can see, you have light on exactly what you're looking at. This is definitely what I use 90% of the time under a car, headlamp. And that's really about it for the general tools. So before we lift the car up, we put it in neutral so that we can get to the torque converter bolts and be able to spin it over.
Fun stuff, man. And spin the drive shaft.
Exactly. So now we're gonna lift it up. I'll just give you guys a quick tour underneath the car just to kind of give you a representation of how much nicer lower mileage cars are, which is generally what you get with an automatic. That's not at all saying that all automatics are low mileage, but it's definitely easier to find an affordable, low mileage, nice condition car when it's a sports car and automatic, as we said before. But I mean, just the lack of grime, the lack of leaks, the lack of just dirt and rust. I mean, look at the frame rails, perfect, no dents, no nothing, pinch welds. I mean, if you were to look under my car, for example, my Miata, which I mean has been heavily modified, but even before that, just being a lowered modified Miata, you know, the previous owner, like, oh, this is bashed in, all the pinch welds are bashed in, this is all drug on the ground, these bolts were ground off. I mean, pretty much any lowered Miata is gonna have a lot of underneath damage, and you just don't see that with a car like this that's never been modified. So the obvious first step is gonna be getting the automatic transmission out of the car. Obviously, to put the manual trans in, automatic trans has to come out. So some of the general things you have to do to get the automatic trans out. First thing we have is these cooler lines. So these run to the radiator to keep the transmission cool. Those are gonna have to get disconnected. You need to pull the exhaust out of the way. As you can see, it goes all the way up here. There's a bracket going to the transmission itself on our situation. So you need to pull the exhaust off, get it out of the way, drain the fluids, which we are lucky enough where this pan actually has a drain plug. Most automatic transmissions, you have to unbolt the pan, crack it loose, drop it down, and that'll allow you to drain it and essentially take the pan off to get all the fluid out of it. Moving back, we need to take the power plant frame off, unclip all the wiring that is attached to the power plant frame that runs front to back because we're gonna be changing this out. So imagine normal car, this is a trans mount. Drive shaft bolts and drive shafts will need to come out. And then auxiliary things need to be moved out of the way. So for example, this brace in our case needs to be moved out of the way. It might look like you can get it out with it in there, but you're better off doing more work, and it generally equates to less work than trying to skip steps and getting stuck halfway in between something. After that, we'll do bell housing bolts. And since this is an automatic trans, one of the biggest differences between installing and removing an automatic trans and a manual trans is torque converter bolts versus flywheel bolts. So with an automatic trans, you have a flex plate, which is bolted to your crank with what would be like flywheel bolts. And then your torque converter is bolted to that plate. So we've got to take this inspection cover off and go and loosen. Generally there's 4. Are there 4 on this car?
I think there's like 6 or 8.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so all of the torque converter bolts need to be loosened, otherwise you will not be able to pull the trans off without dumping fluid everywhere and dislodging the torque converter. On a manual transmission, instead of torque converter bolts, you just have your flywheel bolt and your clutch pack, and the trans slides off of that without having to do any of those ancillary things. So if you're unfamiliar with automatics, very common overly looked item is the torque converter bolt. I've done it myself. Probably the first time I pulled an automatic trans out, I didn't even think about it. I only pulled manual transmissions. Not good. If you can even get it out. You'll spill everywhere. You're most likely it's just not going to come out. It's going to be hung up on the torque converter.
Miata ones definitely come out.
Okay. So yeah, let's get to work. All right, so right now Ben is working on pulling the exhaust out. I start on getting all of the wiring disconnected, going to the power plant frame since we have to pull the power plant frame out. So as I finish that up, Ben finishes up the exhaust. Now I move on to the drive shaft. Ben starts draining the fluid and pulling the transcooler lines off themselves as I get the drive shaft ready to come out. So I pull it out and Ben finishes up the transcooler lines, and then we move on to the ancillary things like that brace and then start pulling the power plant frame off. On this car, it's a little bit of a pain with the power plant frame because that piece that he's prying at gets kind of stuck in there, so we have to pry that out a bit. But once we get it out, The power plant frame comes right off, no problems at all. So now we move on to the wiring, disconnecting all the sensors and stuff. There's more sensors on an auto trans than a manual trans. And then we start tackling this bracket to the exhaust manifold. For the bell housing bolts, I am using a 1/2 inch impact, medium size. I find the medium size impact to be the best all-arounder because it fits a lot of places. Like I just took those 2 bolts off for that bracket, and to get it up in there between the trans tunnel and the trans, it had to be this size. A real big one might not have fit. But we've got a wobble extension, so it allows the socket to kind of wobble around, do its thing. So this is what we're going to use to knock out the rest of the bell housing bolts. So now Ben's fighting with this bracket. You're always going to find one thing on a project that's hard to get to, and you need to trade off with a friend when you start to get tired before you get frustrated. So we battle it out and get that done, and then move on to doing the bell housing bolts, which, as you can see, why I chose the smaller impact, because you need it to fit up in there in those tight to reach areas. So Ben's working on the torque converter bolts while I'm doing this, and he's just having a hard time holding the flywheel still and doing the bolts. So I come in to help him hold the flywheel while he breaks the bolts loose. We get all of them done except one, which stripped out, which we ended up having to cut the leg of the torque converter off since the bolt head rounded off. But we ended up just leaving the torque converter on there while we pulled the trans off, as opposed to trying to fight it in the car. So now we are working on getting a couple of the harder reach bell housing bolts out, including like the starter bolts. It requires one person kind of pulling on the trans to get the impact to fit in there, and another person finagling it around. It's a little bit of a 2-man process. So we had to come up top for 2 things. One, the kickdown cable. We need to disconnect it up here, throw it down the bottom so it can come out with the trans attached as one unit. And then the dipstick fill tube, which is right there, kind of see it, bolts on to the intake manifold. So we need to unbolt that so we can drop it down with the trans as well. Then we can go back up, take the last couple bell housing bolts off, and we are ready to pull her out, which obviously, for those of you who've dealt with manual transmissions for a long time and you know how kind of light a lot of them are, automatic transmissions are not as light. So something to note, if you didn't think of that, they're pretty heavy. You might need a friend. But if you were by yourself, if you were on jack stands, it'd be easier. You know, you could use a jack to pull it out. That's how I do most of them when I work by myself doing like a manual trans swap, lower to the ground. I just use a jack and guide it out. It's kind of sketchy. You really want 2 people, so one person can kind of guide the front while you're working it out. But if you're by yourself, I wouldn't suggest doing it for illegal reasons, but it's not too bad, depending on the trans. Got something in my eye. Wear eye protection. I mean, even with glasses, I still get crap in my eyes. Gloves and eye protection are not uncool. Okay, keeps your hands from getting all messed up and super dirty all the time, and you getting everything else dirty, and it keeps your eyes from getting damaged. Both of those are very important things. So now we do the simple part of the process and just wrangle the automatic trans out. Okay, well, the awful automatic is out. We're letting the torque converter drain into our little drain pan thing here, because it's better than like trying to pull it out. It's just going to go everywhere. So let it drain as much as possible before we yank it out. Automatic transmissions suck. They just suck. They're just so much bigger and heavier. Not all of them, obviously drag, they have their purposes, but just dealing with this big giant automatic, not fun in comparison to a small tiny manual trans like this. Like this is just 10 times easier. I mean, either of us could lift this no problem by ourselves all the way over our heads, stab it. Not gonna happen with the auto. At least the auto is out. I would say the hard part is over in a sense.
Well, the fun stuff is definitely the interior stuff, to be honest.
True.
'Cause it's like pedals and like,
yeah, pedals are gonna be rough because you gotta, anything where you gotta like lay on your back under the dash is not the most enjoyable experience.
No, I mean, as far as like throwing the trans in is easy.
Yeah, throwing the trans in will be easier than taking the auto out.
Here, besides the fact that we got to replace the header too.
Yeah, so as usual, there's always something that you're gonna run into that's a struggle, and ours was both the studs snapping on that side and then that stud or the nut on that stud stripping. So we just had to cut the header off to get the trans out. So we gotta fix that. But something equally important working on cars is nourishment. So it's time to take a lunch break and then get back to it.
Some food before me and Taylor kill each other.
Very important. So we're back to work, and I am pulling the torque converter off. All the bolts are loosened. We're just taking them out by hand. Like I said, we did have that one round off. Ben was using some cheaper wrenches, and since the bolts are tight, it just rounded the head off. He switched to the Milwaukee wrenches I have and didn't have a problem on the rest of them. So something to think about when you're doing a bolt that's hard to get out if it does strip. Nice tools are important. All right, so here's the main difference between a manual trans and an auto trans as far as power conversion. So on a manual trans, you have your flywheel, then you have your clutch disc, and you have your pressure plate. So the clutch disc is sandwiched between the two. You have your pressure plate fingers. Your throwout bearing either pulls those off or pushes those on or in to release the clutch and allow the engine to spin freely. Automatic trans, you have a flex plate, much lighter than a flywheel. You can see how thick and solid a flywheel is. It's a big piece. This is very light, very thin. Its job is just the converter bolts to it, and then it has a ring gear for the starter, which is built into this. And then your converter goes on, and that is what transmits your power, and it's kind of your disconnect between the engine and the trans. So for those of you who don't know, that's what the two systems look like. So now that we have all of our automatic crap out, it is time to move on to installing our manual stuff. So we're gonna go ahead and throw the flywheel on. This would be a great time to do a rear main seal if you have a leaking rear main seal. This one is still factory and mint, like no leaks. It could go either way. I personally like OEM parts, and on a car with like this low mileage, I'd rather have the OEM seal that's already in there than try to put some aftermarket one in. But you know, it is one of those things. While you got it out, it might be worth doing, and obviously it's definitely worth doing if it's leaking. So you wanna check that over, see if you've got any leaks. It's pretty easy to tell. Even if you didn't have any external leaks, you would see them here. You would have oil down here, but this is all clean and dry, top and bottom, sides. I mean, it's honestly mint, so we are not gonna worry about replacing that. So yeah, now we gotta install the clutch setup, get it all aligned, and then we can stab the trans in. Been throwing some blue Loctite on the flywheel bolts.
Normally wouldn't do this, but you know, since Taylor's videoing me.
True, true.
I'm kidding.
No, normally, I mean, you're supposed to replace flywheel bolts if they stretch, but we check them all, and you can tell if they're stretched. It's very easy to visibly see the stretch, so they're fine. You need a bolt. So we gotta throw all these on, torque them down, and then we can install the pressure plate and clutch disc. For clutch alignment, what you would normally do is put a clutch alignment tool in it. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? You slide the tool in with the clutch pack, boom, put it on, bolt it down, you're good to go. So if you don't have a clutch alignment tool, you lost it, you forgot about it, you need to put your trans in, what you do is you take a 1/2 inch extension. That'll allow you to move the clutch disc around. What I do is I snug up 2 bolts just enough to where I can move the clutch disc with a good amount of force, but it'll stay put if I just let it go. And then I stand eye level with it, sit eye level with it, whatever you gotta do. And then center it at, like, in the fingers and in, like, with the bearing. So you've got 2 reference points. Once you get it centered, snug them down, and then torque them down, put the trans in. I've honestly sometimes had better luck with that than with clutch alignment tools. Like, I'll use a clutch alignment tool, if trans doesn't want to go on, I'll move it around some. With a 1/2 inch extension, works fine. When you're pulling the transmission off, the weight of the transmission is tilting the engine back, which is how you're able to get to the top bell housing bolts. However, when you go to put it on, the engine has sprung back to its straight up position. So now what we're gonna do is, in taking this cover off, the factory under tray, and we push up the front, shove a piece of wood between the subframe and the oil pan, and that keeps the engine tilted back enough for us to get the new trans in. So before we proceed with putting the new trans on, we need to take the transmission cooler lines out. So normally they would go into the radiator, some of which you would have to cap them off. They'd be in like the in tank, but since this one has an aftermarket radiator, it's got a trans cooler. So we'll just be removing the trans cooler, taking the lines out. So now that they're free, we'll just yank them out. And then it is time to throw the man box in, the manual. Ta-da! I wish I was recording this in real time because, like I said, I've had great luck eyeballing, aligning the clutch, and the trans popped right on. We didn't have to fight with it at all. We got the input shaft in and boop, popped it right on, no problems at all. It was amazing. If you saw when we stabbed the trans onto the LS before we put this motor back in my car, I literally talked about how sometimes transmissions go on easy and sometimes they don't go on easy. This one was about as easy as it gets. We got it up. As soon as we got in the splines, slight jiggle left and right, boom, popped all the way in, no problem.
Lucky.
I will say, in my experience, every time I've aligned the clutch by eye, I've had good luck. Every time I align it with the alignment tool, I don't. Like the Z-Trans on the LS, aligned it with the clutch alignment tool, they took us forever to get the trans on. this thing, and every other time I've done it, aligning by eye goes right on. I don't know what it is. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's got to just be luck, but just interesting. But yeah, no, literally went on cake. Manual swap's already treating us good, Ben.
I know, already better than the auto.
Yeah. So yeah, we got to tighten all the bell housing bolts down. We've got most of them in, get the starter back on, and then we'll do power plant frame, hook the wiring back over.
Stuff while we're
while it's down. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention, on non-Miata specific, you need to change your pilot bearing or pilot bushing from the automatic one to a manual one. Some might be the same, but a lot of times the inner diameter is different and you will need to press it out. You can use the grease method, where you shove a bunch of grease in there and push something to basically pressure push it out. I've never had great luck with that, but you will need to change that. Fortunately, on a Miata, you have the pilot bearing is in the flywheel, so as long as you actually have it in the flywheel, you're good. You don't have to press it out of anything. So makes it easy on a Miata, but made me almost forget to tell you guys about that for most other cars where it's going to be in the crank itself. All right, so basically the only thing we need to wire up in this swap is our reverse lights. So the sensor is different from the automatic trans to the manual. So Ben is putting some spade connectors on to hook basically the automatic wiring to the manual transmission reverse light switch. So before we can move on to the drive shaft and the power plant frame, we have to remove the factory shifter to get the shift arm out of the way. Then we can lift it back up and go back down underneath and finish everything up down there. So now it is time to wrap up everything underneath. So we're putting the power plant frame back on, which is basically your trans mount. And then we move on to getting the wiring on the power plant frame. I get the drive shaft in and start putting all of the bolts in. Definitely important, if you've never done drive shaft bolts, make sure you tighten them very well. It's a kind of a vibration item, so they will come loose. We drop the car down to make sure the shifter's in the right position and get the shifter itself back in. Make sure the car is in neutral to make it easier to spin everything over and tighten all the bolts down. So then we raise it back up and finish our last bits underneath, so then we can move on to the top side of the project. Dude, I'm a drone right now. Well, we have everything done underneath besides the speed sensor, which we need to throw in. We threw the shifter in, easy enough. We have a bunch of stuff up top to do tomorrow, different center console shift boot section. We need to do the clutch pedal, brake pedal, and then we need to do the clutch sleeve and line and run those down, bleed the clutch, and that's pretty much it. So Ben's gonna take the plastics off and we're gonna pick this back up tomorrow.
So I got a little ahead of myself.
All right, so the hardware portion, the grunt work of the project is basically done at this point. So the trans is in, drive shaft's in, trans mount, all that stuff. That's basically, the car is now a manual, but it cannot work without the peripherals. That involves adding a clutch pedal and changing the brake pedal. So Ben went ahead and got started and decided to pull the dash out. So that is not necessary. You don't have to pull the dash out. But on Miatas, it's relatively easy to pull the dash out, and it's relatively difficult to get down there with the dash in because it's such a small car.
Yeah, the issue I ran into is I got the ECU out, but the ECU is literally 2 bolts, and it took me probably 15 minutes of quarter turns to pull it out. Then I went to go try to switch the brake pedal, and it was just impossible with the dash in there.
Yeah, you can definitely do it if you have a vehicle where it's really hard to pull the dash out. It's just, especially in a Miata, it's a very tight, confined space. So you're laying upside down, trying to reach under there. It's difficult. So sometimes, like we said before, doing more work equals less work. So it seems like more work to pull the dash, but if it makes the pedal swap take 2 minutes instead of 2 hours, probably worth it. So the reason you have to swap the brake pedal is an automatic brake pedal is really wide because there's no clutch pedal in the way. There's no clutch pedal involved. However, when you put a clutch pedal in, you now have another pedal there. So you switch the brake pedal to either a small standard brake pedal like this, or you can cut this one down basically to gain that clearance that you need. Some cars are really tight. Like if you were to leave the automatic pedal in, it would be over the clutch. So yeah, the proper way would be to swap to a manual pedal. And then the clutch pedal, most cars, the manufacturer is not going to make different firewall templates for an automatic or a manual because all that stuff is kind of done after the fact. They build the body and then they put in whatever it's going to be, automatic, manual, etc. So the firewalls are usually all the same. So on some cars, you basically just have dimples there. So it'd be recessed in where that main hole is. recessed in where the studs come out, and you would just drill those out to mount your stuff. On the Miata,
It has this plate that bolts into the hole. This was in the interior, and then the automatic trans computer bolted to that.
oh, that's interesting.
Kind of neat.
Yeah, so you just essentially take that out. In this car, you take the automatic trans computer out, and then you just slide the clutch pedal in, and then that's where your master cylinder bolts to. So like I said, usually most of the other cars I've seen, you have to drill that out. On a Miata, I guess since they were most commonly manual transmissions, the provision's already there for it. You don't have to cut anything. You literally just unbolt that plate, bolt the clutch pedal in. So from here, next step is going to be to install the clutch master cylinder, route the line down to the clutch slave cylinder, and then your hydraulics are done. Obviously you need to bleed it, but yeah, pretty straightforward. Past that, like we said yesterday, there is some wiring involved depending on the car. Some cars there will be none, some cars there will be a lot.
Really straightforward. Nothing's been hard besides the header swap, which
Yeah.
really wasn't anything to do with the swap.
Yeah, Ben had a lot of trouble with the header swap, but it's one of those things. There's always something you're gonna run into. It doesn't matter how long you've been working on cars. Doesn't matter how easy you think the project's gonna be. I mean, this is a
Doesn't
Miata.
matter if you only work on the same car.
Yeah. I mean, Ben's ripped apart hundreds of Miatas, and still you run into issues. You run into struggles, and that is something you need to account for. If you're doing this swap on, say, your daily driver, and you need to get it done to get the car to work, minimum account for an extra day. Minimum account for an extra day. Because either you're gonna run into an issue where you're missing something that you need that you didn't think about, or you find out something's broken that needs to be replaced and has to be replaced while you're doing the process. Things like that. There's a lot of factors involved. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and throw the clutch master cylinder in, clutch line in, and then we're pretty much done. So one of the last steps of the project is installing the clutch master cylinder and hard line. There's already clips on the firewall for the hard line to clip into, and then we're using a soft braided line down to the slave cylinder because it's just a lot easier to bleed than the factory coil setup. I then have to tighten down the bolts for the master cylinder to the studs that come from the clutch pedal through the firewall. And that's pretty much the last bit of the engine bay. So we move on to the interior, getting that all finished up. First step is putting the dash in. We had to finagle with it a little bit. The bolts didn't want to line up, but we managed to get it back in without much headache. And then we were able to finish putting the interior back together and finish up the project. All right, the car is completely back together. The last few things we had to do weren't really specific to the manual swap. It was pretty much generic stuff, putting the interior back together. The other couple things that needed to be done are just very simple stuff. We filled the gear oil up, bled the clutch, and that was pretty much it. Put the exhaust back on. So the last bits were just your very simple maintenance stuff that most of you should already know how to do. So we didn't go too into detail on that. Interior wise, the only thing that really changed is the pedals were added, obviously. And then on Miatas, it's super easy because a lot of cars, this plate is different from an automatic to a manual. On the Miatas, it's the same, you just add a shift boot. So on some cars, you'll have to find the actual manual shift boot trim bezel. And then on some cars, it might be a completely different center console. But otherwise, the interior should remain pretty much the same. Like we said, you don't have to take the dash out. That is just, on a car like this where it's easy to take the dash out, it's worth the added time to not be laying on your back stuck under a steering wheel. So other than that, that pretty much covers the entirety of the manual swap. Like I said, there was some wiring that needed to be done to get the speedo to work and things like that. And that will also be different for every car. So there's not really any way to kind of cover that in a general sense. I mean, some cars you might not have to do anything. Speed sensors will be the same. Like on a Z, for example, the speed sensors are in the diff. So the speedo would still work auto to manual. I didn't really go too far into detail on that just because, again, it's gonna vary a lot depending on what car you're doing it on. But other than that, I think we've covered everything involved in the swap. If you guys have any questions as far as manual swaps go, if there's anything you think I missed out on, didn't cover, leave it in the comments below and I'll try to make kind of an inclusive comment or description with all the information in the video, and then the added information if there's anything that we missed that is pertinent to doing a manual swap. So let's take this thing for a rip. Purrs like a kitten. Oh God. She's a ripper. It's honestly like a little quicker than I thought it would be. All right, well, the test drive is complete, so that's gonna be it for this video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Goodbye, guys.